Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Ted 2. The first Ted movie I actually liked, and I think it represented probably some of the best of Seth MacFarlane and his style, and the better side of him that normally you might be too embarrassed or the quality of what he's working on is too bad to actually like. But Ted nonetheless was a pretty good, fun, big studio comedy. Ted 2 is the reverse of that. Ted 2 is the worst of Seth MacFarlane. It's all of the things you don't like about him. And Seth MacFarlane in this film, his writing seems to get worse. It feels like there's even more cutaways. It's like Family Guy, where at the beginning it felt like there was more of a point, but as it goes on, there's more cutaways, it gets more stupider, it gets a lot less enjoyable, it becomes more interested in the offensive joke for offensive joke's sake without actually thinking of making a joke. He just does the offensive shock value thing and hopes it kind of works out. And that's most of Ted 2, and that's what makes Ted 2 disappointing. It doesn't try to do the same movie as Ted, and I guess you can give it some credit for that because most comedy sequels do kind of just try to remake the first film. Ted 2 isn't trying to do that, which is a little, I guess, better. Instead of doing Hangover 2, it kind of does Hangover 3. You might respect it a little more for trying to do something different, but it's not like actually a good movie. Seth MacFarlane continues down the road of messing with movies with his own ego and overabundance of ideas to hopefully get something to work rather than keeping it at its basic core elements, which is usually why we like the thing in the first place. Ted, who at the beginning of the film gets married to his girlfriend Tammy Lynn, then decides after a year and the relationship isn't going so well that they should have a kid, which will bring them together, which is a terrible idea. And then of course, since Ted doesn't have a penis, they have to get a sperm sample, and they do this whole thing with Tom Brady that could probably just be cut out of the whole movie, but there's a lot of parts of this movie like that. Then they try to adopt because they realize that Tammy Lynn can't be artificially inseminated because of her uterus is all messed up. So then they go to adopt, but then the adoption agency lets Ted and Tammy Lynn know that Ted cannot actually adopt because he's not legally a person. So Ted and Mark Wahlberg try to mount a legal case against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and the federal government to show that Ted is a person and fight for his personhood in court. And they get stuck with Amanda Seyfried, who's playing a lawyer called Sam Jackson, because the big law firm wants her to get experience and they let her work for them pro bono. And of course she smokes weed just like the other two guys. So they're trying to fight for Ted's personhood so that he can be legally married to Tammy Lynn, whose marriage was then annulled by the state because it wasn't legal, because he was technically property at the time. So they're trying to fight for the legal case and just hang out and be bros somehow in the span of this also, and hopefully let Ted eventually be remarried to his wife and maybe adopt a baby if they can remember that that was a part of this movie by the end of it. You do have to kind of give it credit for taking on a subject like this, but I don't really give it that much credit because it's not like it really knows exactly how to get that to work within the comedy. Because a lot of the problem with Ted 2 is kind of a magnified problem from Ted 1. The main reason you like either of these films is the relationship between Ted and Mark Wahlberg's character. And they have great charisma together. I've never seen a comedic duo, especially with one that's CG and not even there half the time, have such great charisma than Ted and Mark Wahlberg do in these films. But instead of just having them hang out and be funny together, which anytime there are, those are the real highlights of the movie, they cut away to these equal rights cases or have cutaways, which Seth MacFarlane loves to do. And it just feels like, why can't we just have them chill out and like go on a road trip or something and like have something less plot centric? The problem with a lot of films that want to be like more studio comedies than we really make anymore. Now actually Seth MacFarlane, I will say, is very much making a big studio comedy in the way that the Apatow style really doesn't do anymore. And I actually kind of like that. It's shot almost like a sitcom or something, but he at least tries to make a different kind of comedy. It doesn't feel very Apatowian. It does feel like what he's trying to do in a lot of those films that are trying to be like older big studio comedies of the 90s and of the 80s. Those were very tightly plotted films that went to a big conclusion, and in both Ted 2 and Ted 1, it feels like the conclusion's really forced in. Giovanni Ribisi's character really is just an excuse for them to have like a nice third act thing. It really always feels just thrown in there, and he's in this film again, and again he gives the film a pretty unsatisfactory third act, which also has like almost nothing to do with the equal rights case. They get it to connect somehow, but it's kind of a giant leap at that, and involving how Giovanni Ribisi's character of Donnie is a janitor at Hasbro and convinces Hasbro Hasbro that if he kidnaps Ted, since Ted is property, they can inspect Ted and make, you know, a line of Teds basically. But wasn't Ted made by magic? You can't inspect magic. But of course this film doesn't think of that. That's like kind of the big third act thing, but it really feels thrown in there. It's kind of like the thing with Seth MacFarlane is that there is kind of this old studio Hollywood showmanship about him, which I actually really love. No one really has that as much, and he can really do it. The opening, there's a title sequence with Ted and this big musical number that feels right out of something Gene Kelly would do. Although he does a lot of cuts, so it's actually not like something Gene Kelly would do, but it's a better approximation than I see anyone else even attempting nowadays. But it would have been nice if it was one take. I'm just saying, Gene Kelly did it in one take. I mean, he did it in like one shot. It was like awe-inspiring. Ted, it's still like, well, that's really cool, but, and it's a CG bear. Why can't it be done in one take? I'm just saying, Gene Kelly was better than Ted, because that's a debate people were having. But those are films that are tightly structured, have tight plot points, and it feels like Seth MacFarlane has that in him. And each time with these Ted films, it's like he almost refuses because he's joking around with his friends, be like, oh, wouldn't it be wicked awesome if we have these random cutaways? The thing about the cutaways in this film versus the first film is the first film, almost all those cutaways were about character and had something to do with building that character and building that character development and showing something about that relationship. And these are Family Guy cutaways. I mean, obviously it's Seth MacFarlane, but these are very much the cutaways that you hate. The ones in South Park where they talked about the manatees moving beach balls and that's how they write Family Guy. That's how this film feels. The thing about the Ted movies versus Family Guy, it feels like they spend a lot more time on the script than an average Family Guy episode. So the cutaways are actually a lot better. It feels like they really work hard on making those work. This is like 7 drafts later from a Family Guy episode. And I think it makes this film a lot funnier because of that. The jokes and the humor is worked on a lot more, like it really should be if he kind of wants to do this kind of new school comedy meets old 50s 40s comedy thing together. Those are really at a time where they would really work and hone their craft and everything, and I think he wants to do that, but he still wants to be modern, and he hasn't really quite managed to make a good marriage of the two styles together. A lot of times it kind of undermines the whole message of the movie, which is equal rights, which is trying to say something about equal rights and Ted's personhood. Anytime it gets rather serious, they have to have a cutaway to a joke. It really didn't want to be too pointed, even though it was already there, but like anytime it would kind of make that point stick, they'd have to have something stupid happen, like Ted and Mark Wahlberg fighting over a beer while Amanda Seyfried was on the phone. But it almost felt like he was nervous, like, let's not make this thing too serious or something, but let's also make this thing very serious. It's almost like he didn't completely make up his mind with the kind of film he wants to do, but its core elements actually work. I think that's the thing with Ted. I would love to just see a movie of them hanging out. In fact, I actually think if he used the Apatow style with a core relationship he has between Ted and Mark Wahlberg, that would be an awesome movie, and I think people would really like that. But like Seth MacFarlane won't let that happen for some reason. The thing with the first film, it kind of makes sense when you have a teddy bear and this guy, and he's still hanging out with this talking teddy bear, and it's a film about him maturing and growing up, and that kind of makes sense thematically. This film just doesn't. It's like the personhood thing and the case and everything like that. It just feels like an odd avenue for this to go in. It might be a more creative and riskier avenue than most directors and comedies are willing to take, but it's one that doesn't work as well as the first movie. And instead of having another thing about how Mark Wahlberg isn't maturing or anything, they go into this weird avenue. When you're making a sequel, you kind of have to make the sequel that both thematically makes sense and also people want to see. And I think Ted 2 kind of fails on both of those. Now, it goes in an interesting way. That's Seth MacFarlane's biggest problem as a director and a star and a writer, is that he's just putting in too much crap and then hoping if he puts in all these cutaways and bombards you with jokes, and especially shock value jokes, it'll hopefully work a lot better. But it just feels like a massive amount of insecurity. I've never felt like he's a fine-tuned storyteller, especially for someone who's as successful and as big as and as big of a star as Seth MacFarlane is. He just doesn't have it there as much as he really should. It's kind of a shame, and it feels like he gets worse and worse as time goes on. Before Family Guy got canceled, it was a lot better than when it came back, and as it's gone on, it seemingly keeps getting worse. Ted 2 is a similar example of that. He's not really thinking about the core dynamics of the film and like what brought people into the theater. He's trying to be like more than that. He has this insecurity where he wants his films and his shows to really say something, but in doing so, he's actually made them a lot emptier and forgettable forgettable and have expiration dates more than I think most comedies could even dream of doing. I actually agree with a lot of the politics that he has as well. I just don't think they really fit into Ted 2. And I would have liked a simpler, less complicated film, and especially one that has a third act that feels like kind of almost an afterthought to the whole thing. Although we did get to see Patrick Warburton dressed as the Tick, which I was the only one who laughed at in the theater. If he wasn't so obsessed with cutaways, and he wasn't so obsessed with trying to do all this political stuff, which he does in Family Guy, he needs to understand what both the audience wants and what he's really good at. And I think that would be something that Seth MacFarlane would be phenomenal at, and we could have a really great Ted movie. It feels like they tried harder than most comedy sequels to do something different. I feel like they tried in the wrong avenue and tried maybe a little too hard, so they had the reverse effect where them trying hard actually did make it a lot worse. Seth MacFarlane just overdoes it. His overdoing it, his over cutaways, all the things he brings too much to the table and makes people complain and regret that he's become so popular. And Ted 2 isn't what Ted was, where you're like, oh, this is charming, this is different, I don't really like Family Guy, and I even said in my first review, I'm embarrassed to say I like this movie. I'm not embarrassed to say I like this movie because I don't really like this movie. It's like he's kind of just solidifying the problems we've always had with him and the criticisms we've always had of him. And sure, there are certain things that made me laugh, and there's certain cutaways that actually really work, and it does feel like he worked harder on this script than a Family Guy episode. The same problems we're having over and over again with him, and it just feels just as boring as it is to try to make it through a Family Guy episode, but maybe a little more funny, but honestly not that much more enjoyable. So if you have seen Ted 2 and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.